The ballroom at Ardenmere had not been lit in 3 years, and someone had done it anyway. Every chandelier blazed. The candles in their tiered brass arms threw gold across the plasterwork ceiling and down the long walls where Henrietta's father had once hung his survey maps, the walls now bare and pale where the frames had protected the paint. She stood at the room's far edge in her gray wool traveling dress, the hem still faintly damp from the carriage step, and she looked at the assembled company of Lady Dorothea Vane's house party, filling her father's ballroom with their silks and their laughter and their absolute certainty that this house belonged to no one they were looking at. A footman offered her a glass of champagne. She accepted it. She did not drink it. Across the room, Julian Marsh, Duke of Crestwood, turned from his conversation and looked directly at her, and his face gave nothing away at all. She had not come to beg. She had come to buy. 18 months earlier, Henrietta had sat in a solicitor's office in Bath and listened to a man named Mr. Barwell explain, in the careful, slightly apologetic tone that solicitors reserve for bad news delivered to people who cannot afford lawyers of their own, that her father's estate of Ardenmere, 310 acres in the county of Somerset, had been placed in the hands of creditor trustees following his death and the subsequent settlement of his debts. The house and its lands would be sold to satisfy what remained. She was 23 years old at the time, and she had nodded once, and then she had asked Mr. Barwell to describe the precise mechanism by which an interested party might make a formal offer. He had looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man recalculating a column he had thought was already balanced. Her father had taught her the names of every field on those 310 acres. He had drawn the survey map himself, ink and careful measurement, a work of particular devotion for a man who loved the land more than any title it might carry. He had named the western meadow for her mother, and the eastern wood for a Latin phrase, meaning the place where things begin again, and Henrietta had memorized both names before she was 10 years old. When the debt had come, it had come the way her father's troubles always came, not through extravagance, but through misplaced trust, a partner in a speculation who vanished and left the loss behind him. The house had stood as collateral. The law was indifferent to sentiment. Her maternal grandmother had left her a legacy of £4,200, held in trust until her 25th year or her marriage, whichever arrived first. Henrietta was 24, unmarried, and in possession of a letter from her grandmother's solicitors, confirming that the trust had been released into her name, following a petition she had filed on grounds of the estate emergency. She had spent the intervening 18 months in correspondence with Mr. Barwell and the creditor trustees, establishing her standing, confirming the purchase sum, learning every term of the conveyance deed with a precision that had, more than once, surprised Mr. Barwell into silence. £4,200 exactly. The trustees had accepted it. The deed was signed. Mr. Barwell carried it in his leather case, and he was somewhere in this ballroom tonight, having arrived on the afternoon coach at her specific request, because she had known, from the moment Lady Vane's letter reached her at her lodgings in Bath, inviting her to view the property ahead of its formal sale, that there would be a performance to manage. She had not expected the performance to begin quite so quickly. She had arrived at Ardenmere that morning in a hired post-chaise, traveling alone as an unmarried woman of limited income must, and Agnes had been standing at the side entrance with a look on her face that Henrietta recognized from childhood, the particular compression of the mouth that meant Agnes had already seen something that wanted correcting. Agnes had been her father's housekeeper for 22 years, had stayed on through the trustees' administration, at a reduced wage that she described, when asked, as adequate, and that Henrietta privately calculated as far below it. She was a small woman of 60 or thereabouts, with gray hair and a straight back, and she had taken one look at Henrietta's damp hem and said, without preamble, "The drawing-room fire is lit. Come inside before Lady Vane's party notices you came in through the garden." Henrietta had asked about the map. Agnes had pressed her lips together. Lady Vane's footman moved the survey maps to the morning room. One of them was damaged in transit. I tried to explain that your father's maps were not furnishings to be repositioned, but no one consulted me. The damage, when Henrietta saw it, was a long tear through the western meadow and part of her mother's name. It was repairable. She knew it was repairable because her father had taught her to repair survey paper with rice paste and a fine brush, the same way he had taught her most practical things. Quietly, without ceremony. As though, of course, she would need to know. She had asked Agnes for the materials and spent the early morning hours at the morning room table, the paper flat under her hands, the brush moving in small, careful strokes, her father's handwriting reassembling itself around the tear. She was entirely absorbed in it. She did not hear the footstep in the doorway behind her. She did not know until much later that Julian Marsh had stood there for some minutes before turning away without a word. What she did know was that when she entered the main hall at 11 o'clock to present herself to Lady Vane, she was not invited to do so as a guest. Lady Vane received her in the great hall's doorway rather than in a sitting room, which was its own small signal. She was a tall woman of 60, with iron-gray hair arranged in the precise architectural style of a woman who considered precision a form of authority, and she looked at Henrietta's gray wool dress with the eyes of someone who had spent 50 years reading social position in fabric. Miss Cecily Frome stood at her elbow, a young woman of 19 with pale ringlets and a rose silk morning dress that had cost what Henrietta reckoned at 3 seasons of Agnes's reduced wage, and she gazed at Henrietta with the mild curiosity of a person who has not yet learned to disguise it. "Miss Ashby," Lady Vane said, in a tone of polished condescension that Henrietta had heard before and did not find surprising. "How good of you to come. I understood from Mr. Barwell's correspondence that there was some question about the estate's prior ownership. I hope you have not come all this way under any misapprehension about the property's availability." "I have not," Henrietta said. "I have come regarding the deed." Lady Vane's smile did not reach the calculation in her eyes. "Of course, my dear. A petition of some kind, I believe. You must speak with Mr. Barwell when he arrives. He can explain to you how these matters proceed." She turned back toward the hall's interior. "In the meantime, one of the footmen will show you to a room. The guest rooms at the front are reserved for my party, naturally, but I'm sure we can find you something suitable." She was not a guest. She was a supplicant. That was the classification Lady Vane had assigned before she arrived. And the morning room, the east-facing room with the small window and the view of the kitchen garden, was the confirmation of it. If she had been asked to describe what that moment produced in her chest, she would have said it was something between fury and grief. She did not say so to anyone. She unpacked her traveling case with steady hands, hung her one dinner dress on the back of the door, and went to find Agnes. That evening, the first of the house party's 2 formal dinners, Lady Vane had seated her below Miss Frome and above no one of consequence, the precise social geography of dismissal. She had sat and eaten and listened and said very little, and she had watched the Duke of Crestwood across the table with the same careful attention she had given the survey map that morning. He was not what she had expected. She had expected, from the way Lady Vane spoke of him, a man whose rank produced a kind of satisfaction in his own person. Instead, she found a man of 34 or 35 with a face that seemed to have been set very deliberately to reveal nothing. Not coldness precisely, but the deliberate management of expression that suggested someone who had, at some point, decided that the cost of visibility was higher than its benefit. He spoke when addressed. He answered with economy. He ate without appearing to take much notice of the food. He looked at Miss Cecily Frome when Lady Vane directed the conversation toward her, with the careful courtesy of a man executing a duty he had not chosen. Once, during the fish course, he looked directly at Henrietta. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She met his gaze, and he held it. And then Lady Vane said something at his left shoulder, and he turned, and it was over. And she was left with the odd sensation of having been briefly and precisely appraised by someone whose appraisal she did not yet have the context to interpret. She would place a pause here for a breath, and leave one question hanging in the air. What had he seen in those 3 seconds that made him look at all? If this story has already reached you, leave a word below and stay with it. The next morning she was again in the morning room, this time not at the table, but near the window, because the light was better there for reading the trustee's correspondence she had brought in her case, and it was there that she first encountered the Duke in a setting that was not a dining room. He came in with the air of a man who had not expected the room to be occupied, stopped in the doorway, and said, with no particular inflection, "I beg your pardon." "Not at all," she said. He did not leave. He looked at the papers in her hands, then at the repaired map now lying flat on the table drying, and then at her. "You repaired that," he said. "My father made it," she said. "I learned from him." A pause that she could not read. "Is the repair sound?" "It will hold," she said. He looked at the map a moment longer, and then he looked at her, with something in his expression that was neither the cool appraisal of the dinner table nor the careful social blankness he maintained in Lady Vane's company, something she could not name precisely, and therefore filed away to consider later. "You should eat breakfast," he said. "Agnes tells me you came down at 6 and have had nothing." She found this startling on at least 2 counts, that he had spoken to Agnes, and that he had apparently found the answer worth reporting. "I had coffee," she said. "That is not breakfast, Miss Ashby." He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet room with the repaired map drying beside her, and tried to determine whether she had just been given an order, and whether she was going to obey it, and whether those 2 questions were distinct from a third question that had begun, inconveniently, to form in some less practical region of her thinking. She went to breakfast. Agnes was in the corridor when she emerged, carrying a tray back toward the kitchens, and she gave Henrietta the look of a woman who has managed other people's households long enough to know when something is developing that will require patience. "He asked me about you this morning," Agnes said without preamble. "The Duke. He wanted to know how long I had been here, and whether your father was the man who drew the survey maps." She paused. "I told him your father had drawn every map on this estate for 30 years, and that you'd been helping him since before you could hold a brush properly." "What did he say?" Henrietta asked. "Nothing," Agnes said. He looked at the morning room door for a moment. Then he thanked me and walked away. She reset the tray on her hip. "He is not what Lady Vane believes him to be. I have seen enough of those to know the difference." The second day of the house party brought with it a sharper edge to Lady Vane's management of Henrietta's presence. There was a tour of the grounds in the morning, the assembled guests walking the south gardens while Lady Vane described the estate's acreage and prospects in terms calibrated for buyers, and Henrietta walked at the edge of the group and listened to the woman describe 310 acres she had never managed, as though she were their natural custodian. When a guest, a ruddy-faced baronet named Sir Thomas Elmore, asked who had laid out the formal gardens, Lady Vane said smoothly, The previous family had some small feeling for horticulture, and Henrietta felt the reduction of her father's 30 years of careful stewardship land like a stone into still water. She said, because she could not quite stop herself. The pleached lime walk was my father's design. He planted it in the year of my birth, which was the same year as the westernmost boundary wall. He thought the two undertakings deserved to mature together. Lady Vane turned to look at her with the calibrated patience of a woman who has encountered inconvenient facts before and knows how to wait them out. "How touching," she said. "A provincial attachment to one's origins. Miss Ashby has come a long way on sentiment, I fear." She addressed the last sentence to Sir Thomas, but arranged it so the entire party heard it, and Henrietta felt the air around her shift slightly as the group processed the reclassification. Provincial. A woman of sentiment rather than standing. The first label, spoken at the side entrance that morning of her arrival, had been supplicant. This was the second voicing, and it had a larger audience. She did not answer. She had not expected quite yet to need to. That afternoon she found herself, by a route she afterwards conceded was not entirely accidental, on the east terrace where the Duke stood alone with his coat collar up against the October wind, looking out at the wood line along the eastern field. And she stood beside him for a moment before either of them spoke. "The wood is called Initium," she said. "My father named it. It means the place where things begin again." He did not look at her. He looked at the wood. "I know some Latin," he said. I had wondered. "Did you ask Agnes?" "I asked Agnes most things this morning." A pause. The wind moved through the lime walk below them with a sound like turning pages. "She told me your father died 6 months after the debt was called, that you were in Bath when it happened." She had not expected him to say that. She had expected something procedural, something about the estate's prospects or the terms of the sale, and instead he had named the specific geography of her worst year, the rooms in Bath where she had received the letter, the days after, and he had done it without any of the careful social awkwardness that usually accompanied condolence, as though he was simply stating something he thought she was owed the acknowledgement of. "I was," she said. He turned then and looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen there before. A small fissure in the discipline. Not grief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has located grief in someone else and found it adjacent to their own. He looked away again toward the wood. "I had a ward," he said. His voice remained level. "A child, Thomas, 8 years old. His parents died within the same winter. First his mother, and then his father. His father's family contested the guardianship I had been named in the will." He paused. "The law found in their favor. They took the child in January, and I have not seen him since." He was quiet for a moment. "That was 2 years ago." She understood then what she had been reading as coldness. It was not indifference. It was the discipline of a man who had learned that feeling visible things in front of visible witnesses produced nothing except the appearance of weakness. And weakness had not helped Thomas, and so the discipline had hardened into a habit that served no living purpose now except to protect the wound from further contact. She did not say any of this. She said, "I am sorry." He looked at her. It was the same quality of attention as the dinner table 3 seconds, but different in kind. Slower, less appraising, more as if he were trying to reconcile something he had expected to think with something his actual person was doing instead. "Go inside, Miss Ashby," he said. "It is too cold on the terrace." She went inside. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand on the wall and her heartbeat audible in her own ears, and decided that she required several more minutes with the correspondence in her traveling case before she was in any condition to be in a room with other people. She found Agnes in the morning room instead, and Agnes looked at her face and put down the duster she was holding and said nothing at all, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to her since she arrived. It was Agnes who came to find her late that evening, after the supper had concluded and the party had moved to the drawing room, and Agnes who pressed her lips together in the particular way that meant something had happened that wanted immediate management. "Lady Vane has been talking," she said, "to Sir Thomas and to the Hargreaves party. I was in the corridor. She said you were not a purchasing party. She said you had come on some confused legal claim with no proper standing, that you were the late master's daughter, yes, but that a daughter with no male support and no family of consequence had no realistic capacity to acquire the property, and that your presence was, in her word, an imposition." Henrietta heard all of this with the sensation of someone watching a door being closed from the inside. "How many people were in the corridor?" "The corridor," Agnes said carefully, "connects to the drawing room. The drawing room held 11 guests, Lady Vane's entire party. She had not yet shown the deed to anyone in this house. She had been waiting for the right moment, for Mr. Barwell's arrival, for the proper public setting that would make the conveyance irrevocable rather than merely arguable. Lady Vane had now forced the question of timing. She slept poorly and was at the morning room table at 6, with the trustees' letters spread before her and the deed in its envelope at her right hand, going over the terms one final time, not because she doubted them, but because precision was the only form of confidence she had ever found entirely reliable. Mr. Barwell arrived on the afternoon coach, as arranged. She met him at the side entrance, because by now the side entrance was hers by assignment, if not yet by law. And he confirmed, in his careful solicitor's voice, that the conveyance was fully executed and that her title to the property was sound. He looked at the house, then at her, and said, "Lady Vane's party is still in residence. They will not be much longer," Henrietta said. That evening was the house party's concluding dinner, followed by an informal ball in the Chandelier Bright Ballroom, and it was here that Lady Vane arranged her third and final voicing of the classification she had assigned Henrietta on the morning of her arrival. It began as Henrietta entered the ballroom. Lady Vane was positioned at its center, with Miss Cecily Frome and the Duke at her immediate left, and she raised her voice just enough to carry to the nearest cluster of guests, a voice trained by a lifetime of ballrooms to reach exactly as far as intended. "Miss Ashby," she said, with the warmth of a woman who has decided that mercy is its own form of authority. "Come, my dear. I have been explaining your situation to the Duke. He understands entirely that you arrived here under some quite forgivable confusion about the estate's terms, and I am sure that once Mr. Barwell has clarified the realities, we can find some manner of assistance for you that does not require further embarrassment." She looked at the assembled company with the practiced smile of a woman closing a door gently. "The poor girl has come all this way on a misapprehension. A petitioner in a purchasing room. It is not her fault. Her father's affairs were simply beyond what she could be expected to manage." The room was listening. Henrietta could feel it, the quality of attention that a well-managed social cruelty produces, the slight stillness of people waiting to see whether the object of the sentence will accept the classification. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at Mr. Barwell, who was standing near the room's eastern wall with his leather case at his feet, and his expression carefully composed in the way of a man who has been asked to witness something he did not expect, and who is deciding what his professional duty requires. She walked to him across the width of the ballroom, and the room's attention moved with her. "Mr. Barwell," she said, "the deed, if you please." He opened the case, removed the document, and held it out. She took it with steady hands, turned, and addressed the room. Not loudly, not with the theatrical projection of Lady Vane's social management, but clearly in the register of someone who has said difficult things in quiet rooms before and knows that precision carries further than volume. My name is Henrietta Ashby. I am 24 years old. I am the daughter of George Ashby, who designed and managed this estate for 30 years, and whose survey map of these 310 acres hangs repaired in the morning room. 6 weeks ago, the creditor trustees of Ardenmere accepted a purchase sum of £4,200 in full satisfaction of my father's outstanding debts, and conveyed the title to this property to me by signed deed. Mr. Barwell executed and witnessed that conveyance. I have not come as a petitioner. I have come as the owner of this house. The room did not move. Lady Vane's expression underwent a small, precise collapse, a narrowing at the eyes, a tightening around the mouth, the expression of a person whose script has just been taken from her hands. Mr. Barwell said, in the quiet, carrying tone of a man who understands that his role in this moment is procedural and must be executed without embellishment. The conveyance deed is signed and dated the 14th of October. Miss Henrietta Ashby is the titled owner of Ardenmere and its 310 acres, free of encumbrance. The purchase sum of £4,200 was accepted in full by the trustees on that date. The title is sound. There was a sound at the edge of the room. Agnes was standing in the ballroom's doorway, where she had no business standing if business were the measure of presence, and she looked at Sir Thomas Elmore, who was nearest to her, and she said, with the compressed precision of a woman who has been waiting 22 years for the correct moment, "She is George Ashby's daughter. She learned to repair survey maps at that table in the morning room before she was 12 years old." I was there. Lady Vane said, "This is quite irregular." But the sentence had lost its architecture. The way a sentence does when the room it was meant to govern has stopped listening. Miss Cecily Frome, whose ringlets were slightly disarranged from the evening's earlier dancing, looked at Lady Vane, and then at Henrietta, and then at the Duke with the expression of a young woman rapidly reassessing the geometry of a situation she had been placed in by someone else's decision. The Duke of Crestwood had not moved since Henrietta began speaking. He stood at Lady Vane's left where the evening had positioned him, and he was very still in the way that Henrietta had begun to understand was not coldness, but the management of something that required careful management. He looked at Lady Vane. Then he looked at the assembled company. Then he crossed the ballroom. It was not a dramatic crossing. He did not hurry. He walked at the pace of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision at precisely the speed the decision deserves. And the room watched him cover the distance between the ballroom center and its eastern wall, where Henrietta stood with Mr. Barwell and the deed in her hands. And when he reached her, he stopped and turned to face the room with her, and said, in the level declarative voice that carried without requiring volume, "Miss Ashby is the owner of Ardenmere. She is also, if she will have me, the woman I intend to ask to be my wife. These are separate facts. The first requires no permission. The second requires only hers." The room, which had been very still, became stiller. Henrietta felt the breath she had been holding for approximately 48 hours leave her chest. She looked at him. His face was not disciplined in the usual way. The management had come down, not all at once, not theatrically, but the way a window comes open after a long winter, the particular quiet shift of something that has been held closed for a long time, finally releasing along its frame. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had first noticed across the dinner table, and then on the terrace, and then in a dozen smaller moments she had catalogued without yet fully interpreting. And it was entirely legible now. What it was. She had not expected, when she arrived at Ardenmere with her deed and her precision, to find herself also standing in a room feeling as though the floor had shifted very slightly to the right, in a way that was not at all unpleasant. "You might ask," she said, "and then we would know." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. Lady Vane said, at some distance behind him, "Your Grace, I must insist." And he turned his head by approximately 15 degrees and said, without raising his voice, "Lady Vane, you have imposed upon Miss Ashby's hospitality. I think the gracious course is to thank her for her patience and take your leave before morning." He turned back. It was the most efficient dismissal Henrietta had ever witnessed. Lady Vane stood for a moment in the fractured space where her authority had been, and the expression on her face was not cruelty's aftermath, but something quieter and more complicated. The particular recognition of a woman who has arranged a very careful plan and has been shown, with courtesy but without compromise, that the arrangement was based on a misreading. She looked at Henrietta once, and Henrietta held the look steadily, and Lady Vane said nothing further. But she inclined her head in a gesture that was not surrender, and was not apology, and was not quite acknowledgement, but was something in the family of all three. She turned, and Miss Frome turned with her, and they moved toward the ballroom's far exit, with the careful dignity of people who have decided that a graceful withdrawal is the only remaining form of authority available to them. Sir Thomas Elmore looked at the deed in Mr. Barwell's hands, and then at the Duke, and then at Henrietta, and said, with the blunt, honest surprise of a man who has not yet learned to disguise reassessment, "Well, I had no idea." His wife, a small woman beside him who had not spoken all evening, said, "George Ashby's daughter." Of course. As though this explained everything, and perhaps, Henrietta thought, it did. The guests managed their own recalibration by degrees, the way rooms do when a social fact has been revised without ceremony, and everyone present must decide how they are going to arrange themselves around the new understanding. Agnes remained in the doorway for a moment longer, watching with the expression of a woman who has been vindicated by an outcome she predicted but refrained from announcing, and then she took herself back to the corridor with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has work to do and is pleased to return to it. Mr. Barwell closed his case and said he would take his leave in the morning, and Henrietta thanked him, and meant it. The Duke asked, once the room had thinned, whether she would sit with him in the morning room. She said she would. She asked him about Thomas, the child he had lost to another family's legal claim, and he told her more than he had told her on the terrace, not because the telling came easily, but because she asked with the particular quality of attention that had to be answered honestly or not at all. He had spent 2 years believing that the loss of the guardianship was a verdict on his fitness for that kind of trust, and he had not said this to anyone before, because there had not been anyone who would understand it as she did, which was, as a thing that had happened, as a thing that was not his failure even if the law's finding had said otherwise, as a thing that could be held alongside continued living. She did not tell him he was wrong to have grieved it. She told him she thought Thomas had known, in the months before the family contested the guardianship, that he was loved. He was quiet for a long time after that. The fire in the morning room grate had burned down to the good deep phase of combustion that produces more warmth than light, and the room was warm and still around them. She would not know, until the following spring, that he had written to Thomas's guardian family in January, and that they had, in the context of changed circumstances and a new arrangement of influence, agreed to permit a correspondence. She did not know it that night. What she knew that night was that the repaired survey map was dry and flat on the morning room wall, where Agnes had hung it that afternoon, her father's handwriting restored and legible in every field and meadow and wood, the western meadow with her mother's name, and the eastern wood with its Latin, the whole 310 acres present and accounted for in her father's careful hand. Outside, it had begun to snow. She could see it against the dark of the morning room window, the particular quality of October snow in Somerset that falls more like a gesture than an event. Not accumulating yet, just present, making itself known against the glass. If this story has found you at the right moment, leave a word below. There are more stories like it, and they are waiting. The Duke said, looking at the map on the wall. Your father was a precise man. He was, she said. He believed that knowing a thing exactly was the only way to take proper care of it. He turned from the map and looked at her with the expression that had come down from its frame at the ballroom's eastern wall, the expression she now had the full context to read. I believe I understand him, he said. The fire settled in the grate. The snow continued at the window. The survey map of Ardenmuir, 310 acres hand-drawn and repaired and home at last, held every field and wood in its father's ink. She was in her own house,